Welcome and thank you for tuning in. You're listening to the Beyond 50 radio program. I'm Daniel Davis. On the program today, we're going to be going back to the year 1933. It was a time of Prohibition. The Dust Bowl was ravaging through camp, and we had J. Edgar Hoover, who was taking up what it was known as the fledgling FBI. It was also the rise of the gangster. Many people might know names such as Al Capone, or there might be Mo Dalitz, or Charles Luciano. Another one that ravaged through the pages and also the hearts and the imagination of the American public was one known Machine Gun Kelly. On the program today, we're going to be talking about The Year of Fear, which is the book, Machine Gun Kelly and the Manhunt That Changed the Nation. I'd like to welcome to the Beyond 50 radio program today our guest, Joe Urschel. Joe, thank you for joining us here on the program today.
Oh, thanks for having me on.
Machine Gun Kelly, what made you want to write about this guy?
Well, I first ran across him in this story back in the early 1980s when I was on a visit to the Library of Congress. And the library had just converted its indexing system from paper over to a digital database. This is early on in the computer revolution. And so there I am in the Library of Congress, and I just go over to this new database, and just on a lark, I just typed in my last name, which is rather unusual, and I didn't know too many other people other than my relatives with that last name. So I typed this in, and there's only one reference that comes up. And keep in mind, the Library of Congress is thought to be the largest collection of knowledge in the world. So one name comes up, and it's Charles Urschel, kidnap victim. Mm-hmm. And there was one book in the entire library about it, and it was written in 1934. So I called up the book, and I just read it cover to cover, and it was just this fascinating story about this notorious kidnapping that occurs in 1933, and I was just kind of embarrassed because I knew a lot about J. Edgar Hoover, who was one of the main characters in it, and I knew a lot, I thought, about Machine Gun Kelly, but I didn't know anything about the kidnapping victim, Charles Urschel. And it turns out that he's really the hero of the story, but nobody, including myself, who shared his last name, knew anything about him.
And I couldn't help as I was reading the book thinking, I wonder if these two are related somehow.
Yeah. So after I figured that out, I called, I talked to my dad and I said, we must be related to this guy, and he said, no, we're not. And so, like any good son, I decided to try to prove my dad wrong. And I did some genealogical research and whatnot, and it turns out that, if we're related, it dates back, centuries, back to Germany, but there's no familial connection in the United States anyway. But by then I was just really immersed in the story, and I just kept researching it as time went along, and finally got a chance to get it all down on paper, and thus the book.
Mm-hmm. Now, that's the other thing I wanted to find out from you. Just probably in the last few months, this year, I actually interviewed on a book called 30 Illegal Years to the Strip, Bill Friedman. And this was a guy that spent nearly half a century researching this particular book, mostly through first-hand accounts of the Prohibition gangsters and the rise of the people that eventually became known to be the imagination as well as the people that created Las Vegas. And so, this is extensive research, first-hand accounts talking with, the real gangsters within 1 degree of separation of the people that he was writing about in the book. How did you go about getting the research that you did to put this book together?
Well, of course, there's nobody still alive from this story, but I did contact the relatives, the grandchildren of the people who were involved, and I got a little first-hand information from them, and they led me to a lot of really good sources down in the Oklahoma Historical Society and down in Texas, and of course I researched it heavily at the Library of Congress up here in Washington, where I am, and then I basically went through the entire year of 1933, kind of page by page through the Oklahoma and Texas newspapers and the New York Times and several others to get other accounts of what actually happened and what else was going on at the time. So I think the year of 1933 is interesting because there's this confluence of events that occur all within this short period of time. You know, it's the worst year in the Depression, where you've got some cities with unemployment as high as 80%. And then you've got the Dust Bowl starting to kick up, and this we kind of forget what an environmental disaster the Dust Bowl was. I mean, the dust was blowing so frequently and so hard that down in the Southwest it would kill cattle in the fields and stop cars on the road and blow all the way to New England and turn the snow red. And people hadn't experienced anything like that in their life, and they didn't know what was going on. Plus, while all this is happening, you've got this tract of territory that stretches from Dallas, Texas, all the way up to St. Paul, Minnesota, which became known as the Criminal Alley, where you had guys like Dillinger and Pretty Boy Floyd and Machine Gun Kelly sort of just wreaking havoc. I mean, they're robbing all the banks, they're running liquor, and they're operating with virtual impunity. And it's a very dangerous place to live. I mean, the crime rate was incredibly high. The number of murders was almost twice what it is now, and we've got so many more people. And these criminals were getting desperate because in the midst of the banking crisis, there was almost no money left to rob, and Prohibition was coming to an end in 1933, so their sort of sideline of running liquor was drying up, and so they turned to this new form of crime wherein they will kidnap rich Americans and hide them out across the state or county line, preventing the state police from pursuing them or the county sheriffs from chasing them, hold them for ransom, and then after they collect the money, releasing them unharmed with the threat that, okay, we're not going to hurt you now, but if you go to the authorities and come after us, we'll come back and kill you. So it worked pretty well for a number of years. There was an estimated 2,000 successful kidnappings between 1930 and 1933 when this occurs. Of course, the most famous one being the Lindbergh kidnapping, which was still unsolved at the time of the Urschel kidnapping. That investigation had stretched on for over 18 months. And J. Edgar Hoover, who was in charge of the Bureau of Investigation at the Justice Department, was under a lot of pressure to get that kidnapping solved, as well as a lot of the other ones that were out there when this particular kidnapping came along.
Mm-hmm. And it's interesting to note, too, J. Edgar Hoover, which became a household name as a result of being the lead director of the FBI, really had no experience or training in law and criminal investigation whatsoever, and somehow became, the director of the FBI. So you could see why, or understanding his story, why he was really limited or, not really producing results, not to mention at times through specific reading here and there, you would discover he really was kind of a coward. He wasn't really the bravado guy that history tends to seem to remember a guy like him. He's right up there with Elliot Ness, this guy that allegedly was harassing Al Capone, who Al Capone laughingly was just stringing along, The law back in the day just didn't have the kind of teeth that we kind of think that it did back in time.
No, yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, there were very few federal crimes, even on the books. Kidnapping was the only one that really... so J. Edgar Hoover and his group they were only empowered to chase kidnappers across state lines and people who'd stolen cars, or people who were involved in what was referred to as the white slavery market, which is basically a prostitution. So those were the three laws that basically they could enforce. And Hoover didn't really even want to be running a police force. As you say, he had no experience in it. He had no military experience. So he had very little to draw on. He was a lawyer, and he wanted to create a bureau of people just like him. He wanted lawyers and accountants, and he wanted them to be very well dressed as well. And so when this spate of kidnappings comes along, he's really not very well equipped to do it, and neither are his agents, because they at the time were not even a police agency that was authorized to carry weapons. They were unarmed, basically. Mm-hmm. And secondly, they didn't have really any police work experience. And so when FDR takes office, also in 1933, he wants to set up some kind of national enforcement agency that can deal with all these problems that are afflicting the country in terms of crime, and the new Attorney General wants Hoover to enforce those laws and to go out and take on these gangsters that are wreaking all this havoc. And so when the Urschel kidnapping comes along, he's under a lot of pressure to get it solved.
Now, what's interesting about Machine Gun Kelly is he wasn't like the typical gangster of the day that was basically coming off the street from poverty, was tough, streetwise, things like that. He actually came from a very different background.
That's right. I mean, he's a fascinating guy, because most of what we know about him is mythology that was created by J. Edgar Hoover himself and by his wife, Catherine Kelly. Mm-hmm. George Kelly was a guy who grew up middle class in Memphis, Tennessee. He went to a good high school, even went to college for a semester before he flunked out. And that was very unusual, not only amongst the gangster class that he was working with, but just among people in general. But while he's in high school, he catches his father in a tryst with another woman, and basically uses that information to blackmail his dad into underwriting his liquor running business and giving him the family car to do it with. Mm-hmm. He makes a deal with him. He says, "Look, I won't say anything about this, but here's what you got to do for me." And that's basically where he starts his life of crime, by ferrying liquor from Arkansas, which was a wet state at the time, into Tennessee, which was dry. But he was selling them to the people who would caddy for at the country club, or the upstanding members of Memphis, Tennessee's business society. And anytime he'd get in trouble, his father would step in and bail him out. And so from there, he goes on to he later expands his liquor business when Prohibition comes in, and he gets caught selling liquor on an Indian reservation, which was a federal crime. So he ends up in Leavenworth Prison, where he meets a lot of really hard cases. Guys right. who are murderers and accomplished thieves and bank robbers and whatnot. But Kelly's a smart guy, so he manages to figure out a way to get some of these guys sprung out of prison by falsifying documents and other things like that. They tell him, okay, when you get out, if you're looking for work, if you want to join up with one of us, look us up at the Green Lantern Tavern in St. Paul, Minnesota, which of course he does when he gets out. And they introduce him to the bank robbing business, which he then immerses himself in with great enthusiasm.
Now, people have to consider that back in the day, robbing banks certainly was an easy task for the most part, especially if you were someone who planned. And there was one person that you write about in the book who was really detailed about planning bank robberies. I mean, we're talking about down to the fact that he even had routes, he studied maps, the whole bit, and that there were some that just weren't into doing these kinds of things. And there was a very good reason why he was doing this is because take a look at the limitations that the police had at the time. Basically, running around in Model Ts versus the Cadillacs that the gangsters had. It was pretty difficult to really catch these guys as they were, taking part in the bank robbery.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, yeah, the guy you're referring to is Harvey Bailey, who is one of the guys who taught Kelly how to rob banks. And Harvey Bailey was thought to be the most successful bank robber in American history up until that point. He had, and what he did was, he made sure he would study a bank for months before he robbed it. He'd make sure that when he robbed it, the bank would have the most money in its vaults. He'd know when the payrolls were coming in. He'd know where the police station was, what kind of car the police drove, even if they had a car, where the beat cops would walk and when. He'd drive multiple escape routes after to make sure he had a way to get out after he knocked over the bank. And he'd also try to do it without a lot of dramatics,
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, he was so successful in the 1920s that he retired at the end of it and sort of went straight and opened up a bunch of car washes and gas stations in Chicago. But then when the market crashed, he lost all of his money and he ends up going back into the bank robbing business. But yeah, he was quite a character.
Now, Machine Gun Kelly's wife, Catherine, or who became his wife, she was pretty much the character as well. I mean, you pair her together and you almost have a sort of Bonnie and Clyde story.
Right. Catherine Kelly was kind of your classic gangster moll. She was Kelly was her third husband. She was thought to have murdered her second husband when she caught him cheating. And she was one of these glamour queens. She looked great in clothes. She had tons of them. She loved her jewelry, and she wanted to keep graduating into a more and more successful kind of gangster class. And she didn't like the idea that George, her husband, was following this Harvey Bailey model where he was kind of a below the radar. She wanted him to be famous,
sure,
like the other guys that were getting written up in the newspapers all the time. So Kelly himself liked to rob a bank with a concealed .38, and he'd just go up to the counter, and he was a real kind of charming, witty guy, and he'd just toss his satchels over and say, "Fill them up, girls," and he'd be out of there before any histrionics would occur. But Catherine, that wasn't good enough for her. She wanted more money, more success, more fame, and so she goes out and she actually buys Kelly his machine gun. I mean, she buys it at a pawn shop in Fort Worth and gives it to him, and then starts spreading all of these stories about how really good he is with the machine gun. She'd go into speakeasies and leave spent cartridges behind and say, George has been out practicing with his machine gun, and he's gotten so good at it that he can shoot walnuts off a fence post or write his name on the side of a barn with it. And so this legend starts to build about Machine Gun Kelly, and the police start picking up all of these stories, and they're thinking of George Kelly as a guy who's sort of a dangerous psychopath, but in fact he really wasn't.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, he's only known to have shot one person, a bank guard that he wounded in the shoulder, because
that was something that he didn't really want to do.
Right. I mean, he was of the opinion that if you shoot and kill somebody, then the police are going to have to come after you, and they're going to have to come after you hard and fast, but they're almost willing to look the other way and the people are willing to support you as long as you don't wreak a lot of havoc on them, especially out west, because the banks at the time were foreclosing on all of these farmers and foreclosing on all the people's mortgages and things like that during the Depression. So the banks were not particularly popular with people. So they didn't have any problem, a lot of them, with bank robbers going in and stealing the money from the banks that they felt the banks had stolen from them.
And that's so true when you think about this time in America. First of all, the rise of the gangster mostly came as a result of Prohibition. You're denying people out there the need or the want or desire to have a drink, so the gangster says, well, I'm going to go ahead and find a way to supply this to you. That sort of a thing. And for the most part, that's how they work now. Some of them really became corrupt, as far as, for instance, running unions, things like that, and certainly muscle on the street. But for the most part, they were kind of, at times, as you were saying, even somewhat celebrated by the common man who was really struggling during this time, of the Great Depression.
Exactly. I mean, there were stories of these bank robbers. While they were in robbing the banks, they would go into the vaults and tear up various mortgage papers so that people couldn't be foreclosed upon. It's doubtful whether they did that very often, if at all, but that was the legend that had spread, and so it made them kind of popular heroes.
Mm-hmm. Now, back to J. Edgar Hoover. If it wasn't for this, he was pretty much about to get the boot.
He was, in fact, when Roosevelt got elected, his first appointment for Attorney General was a guy, senator from Wyoming named Thomas Walsh. And Walsh had a long history with Hoover, and it wasn't a good one. Hoover had conducted investigations of Walsh during the Harding administration when Walsh and his partners were trying to investigate the corruption therein. And so Hoover had done things like, tried to catch this guy in a compromising position with a prostitute, or he tapped his phone, he read his mail. So Walsh really had a grudge on Hoover, and he declared that once he got in office, he was going to get rid of him. But Walsh, he was an elderly gentleman. He was in his 70s, and before taking office, he gets married to a Cuban debutante in Miami. And on the train ride from Miami to Washington, D.C., his bride wakes up in North Carolina, but he doesn't. And he dies prematurely of what was said to be a heart attack. So Hoover gets a reprise from that, and the next Attorney General is a guy named Homer Cummings, who goes to Hoover and says, look, I want to make a name for myself basically by helping the president deal with this crime issue, and if you can show me that you're the guy to do it, we can really get someplace. So that happens just about the time, just right before this kidnapping occurs. So Hoover is primed and desperate to make sure that he can solve this case and make a name for himself and prove that he needs to keep his job.
Mm-hmm. Now, I think what's really interesting for the listeners to note in the book, The Year of Fear, is that you use quotes quite a bit as though you're right there, sort of in the action while it's happening, so to speak. How did you come to find a lot of these kinds of quotes? Did these emerge through the stories of other people? Were they from, headlines, newspaper columns? Where did a lot of that come from?
Well, there's, I read every book and every piece of research that was out there on this case, including, about 10,000 pages of FBI documents.
Wow.
Which have a lot of great information in them. And then there were several people in the story who had written their own books. Harvey Bailey being one. Kelly's son wrote a book about him, and of course there was incredible documentation of this case in the newspapers at the time, because this case resulted in the largest manhunt in American history up until that time. When they were chasing Kelly and his wife Catherine and their partner Albert Bates, they chased him over 20,000 miles and crossed 16 state lines, once again proving that there was a need for a national police force, and that maybe J. Edgar Hoover ought to be the one to run it. It was just kind of almost handed to Hoover at just the right moment, and he came through and won the case. And it's kind of fascinating the way it plays out, because, as I said, these sources of income were beginning to dry up for people like Kelly, and Catherine was pushing him to make more and more money. So she comes up with the idea that they ought to get into what was referred to at the time as a snatch racket, which is this kidnapping scourge. So she comes up with a plan to kidnap 5 wealthy Texans and Oklahomans and ransom them off one at a time, make $1 million, and then retire and live the life of luxury for the rest of their lives. So the first guy that they target is Urschel. And so they decide to grab him at his house and spirit him off into Texas. So Kelly and Bates, in the middle of late at night one evening, like 11:30 at night, kick in the door at the Urschel mansion and go inside, and they discover 2 couples sitting on the sun porch playing bridge. And to give you an idea of the kind of planning that didn't go into this, Kelly looks at the 2 men and realizes he doesn't know which one is Urschel. So he says, okay, we're here for Urschel. Which one of you guys is Urschel? Right. And neither of them stand up. So then he gets frustrated and makes a lot of threats. And then Walter Jarrett, who was the other guy at the bridge table, he begins to stand up. But then Urschel stands up too. And so Kelly says, well, forget it. We'll take the both of you. And they take them both out into the car. They drive off into the night. And then they decide, they could identify them by looking at their wallets. So they stop the car, take the wallets from the 2 guys, realize which one is Urschel, and they take all the money out of Jarrett's wallet and give him $10 back for a cab back to town, and drive off with Urschel into the night, eventually lodging him at Catherine Kelly's father-in-law's farm outside of Dallas in Wise County.
Mm-hmm. It's just pretty fascinating the way this whole thing was written, because again, it makes you feel like you're in the middle of the action, and there were some surprising things. For instance, I didn't know about, there was also the kidnapping of the son of Charles Lindbergh, and to see things like that sort of seemed to inspire this guy to move in that direction as everything else was drying up. It just seems kind of crazy, but then those were crazy times.
Yeah, they really were. It wasn't a good time to be around the American landscape, but and frankly, it didn't improve very much until after the war. Mm-hmm.
Now, tell us. I'm curious. Do you have a website people can discover more about the book and your work as well?
Well, yeah, you can. I've got an author's page on Amazon, so that would be the place to go. And just look up Year of Fear, and that leads you to my website.
Very good. I want to thank you for taking the time to join us on the program to bring the American Gangster back to life, because that certainly seems to be something that, in the spirit of America, is something a lot of people really take an interest in.
Yeah, yes.
They really do. Again, the book is The Year of Fear, joining us here on the program today, and we want to thank you so much for being here and taking the time to talk with us about the notorious Machine Gun Kelly.
Well, great. Thanks for having me on.
You bet. We want to thank you, the listener out there, for tuning in. You can discover more by visiting us at Beyond50Radio.com. That is the number 50. Sign up for our free weekly e-newsletter. I'm Daniel Davis. Thank you again for joining us, and remember, live your day past